Okay, back again to talk a little bit about American history. Um, Today I want to talk a little bit about the 1920s, as have been doing in the past week or so. But this is a cultural aspect, not a political aspect. This is a little discussion about something called the Harlem Renaissance. You can see a illustration at the time of the Harlem Renaissance. Well, what was the Harlem Renaissance? What is Harlem? Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City. It's in the upper part of the island of Manhattan. It was a development that was put together in the 1870s and 1880s. That was really undersold. It was not a success. And when the Great Migration came about, many African Americans settled there, and it became the center of the African American community in New York, the largest such community in any of the northern cities. There you can see a bustling Harlem. So what was this Renaissance? Well, it's a period of time, maybe from the end of World War I or thereabouts, through directly till the crash of the stock market in 1929 and then beyond. But the lack of funding killed cultural events many places in the country, and Harlem was one of those. It was literary, it was musical, it was poetic, it was all manner of the arts, and it all came together in this neighborhood of New York City. The Harlem Renaissance, historically speaking, as a historical factor, was a direct result of the Great Migration, which we've talked about numerous times now in class. The Great Migration, as we know, but just to define it, was the movement of African Americans out of the old South, out of the Jim Crow South after Reconstruction. And it was something that occurred in the early 20th century when opportunity arose to go someplace else. We've talked about migration or immigration and emigration in terms of push factors and pull factors. Well, if you're a southern sharecropper, the push factor to get away from that is great, but the pull factor now is that there's job opportunity in the northern cities because there's a war on starting in 1917. So there is a rush to go not to just New York City, but to Chicago and Detroit and to Cleveland and to Pittsburgh and to Philadelphia and many, many places in the north. And for African Americans in the South and West, say Texas and Arkansas and places like that, getting out to Los Angeles is a quest. Same sort of process. Now, the Harlem settlement in New York City was not the only one of these, but it was by far the biggest. It was the largest single collection of African Americans living in a neighborhood, I guess you would say, anywhere in the world at the time. You already know the background of the people trying to get away from the sharecropping system and why they would. We've already seen maps like this. Like I said, from the southwest you go west, but from every place else you go north. And there's a direct line from places like Mississippi straight up to Chicago. If you do genealogy of African American families in various northern cities, you can pretty much trace where they came from because of the sort of pipeline in which people were able to make their way north. Well, the hugest portion of the people that came in this, especially in this first wave in the 19 teens, the largest single portion ended up in Harlem. Like I said, Harlem was a pretty sleepy place in the 1880s and 90s. This is a 1900. You can see there's not many people. There's an infrastructure there, but it's not an overcrowded, bustling kind of place. Well, it was a great place for people to come and find housing later because there was so much empty housing available. Why a Renaissance? Well, in the South, you might want to say something if you were black, but you probably didn't think it was prudent to do it. The system was enforced. There was the strictest of strict laws, and we talk about segregation and lack of voting, and we talk them in textbook terms. But to live that life was terrible and dangerous, and lynchings and beatings and all kinds of stuff went on to enforce kind of the social code. Well, I think it's expressed very well. This man here is a writer, a poet and a writer by the name of Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes later was termed to be the poet laureate of the Harlem Renaissance. Very eloquent man. And he wrote a very evocative poem about the Great Migration. He called it One Way Ticket. I pick up my life and take it with me. He's got nothing. He just has got himself. And I put it down in Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Scranton. Any place that's north and east and not in Dixie. Then he talks about going west. Someone else. I pick up my life and I take it on the train to Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Seattle, Oakland, Salt Lake. Any place north and west and not south. Get out of here. And so this is both the push factor and the pull factor. I'm fed up with Jim Crow laws. Fed up with people who are cruel and afraid, who lynch and run. They're scared of me and I'm scared of them. That about covers it, right? And I take it away. It's a one-way ticket. Going up north, going out west, gone. Gone. Okay, so there's this rush when there's the opportunity to leave and to find a way to earn a living in the defense factories of World War I. People take it in large, large numbers. A lot of Hughes, just to dwell on him for a second, was very forward-looking. One of his more famous ones is simply a poem known as Harlem, sometimes known as A Dream Deferred, because that's his most famous line. He says, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up? Does it do this? Does it do that? Or does it explode? And Hughes, amongst a lot of people at the time in Harlem, were able to express things that later were harkened back to in the 1960s in the Civil Rights Movement. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get to it. Voicing opinions like that, like that, could get you lynched in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, North or South Carolina in 1920. Easily. What are you talking about? And you wouldn't say it. You would not say it there, and you would not say it out loud. But in Upper Manhattan, in the neighborhood of Harlem, you might write those words, and you might publish those words, and you might not be in danger. And for that reason, numbers of people, and there's Langston Hughes, here's Zora Neale Hurston, a very famous writer and poet, who talked about black day-to-day life in Florida, where she grew up, very unvarnished, and again something she probably wouldn't have written had she been living in Florida at the time, but she was living in Harlem. Or Claude McKay, who wrote about the racism that he saw in Georgia, openly, but not writing in Georgia, writing in Harlem. And that's not to say that they were fraidy cat type people, it's just self-preservation. But now, in the North, there's plenty of prejudice in the North, but there was no Jim Crow, and there was no organized lynching campaigns, and there was none of that stuff, so that the expression came more easily. And expression led to other people with expression. Probably the best known aspect, I think, is musical. Very famous African American musicians right there, Duke Ellington on the left as you look at it, and Louis Armstrong on the right, were, again, Southern transplants who end up in Harlem, end up performing in Harlem. There was a club in Harlem called the Cotton Club. It was was not named for the ginger ale. It was named for a club, Cotton, associated with the South, black performers, white audiences, where the white folks from Lower Manhattan could take a ride uptown and go to this club and be entertained by African Americans. It was the first taste that many of these white Americans had ever had to African American music. Now, I'm not going to play these, but you can later. It was an area of New York where the white musicians would also go to hear what was happening now and maybe take this music and play it themselves. A person who did that very famously was Benny Goodman. Benny Goodman, the king of swing, didn't pirate music, but he took music that was played in Harlem and heard no place else, and then made it heard around the country. Today, I think a lot of people would call that cultural appropriation, and I think that's it's a thing, I guess. But in the 1920s, it was a pathway to bring African American music, in this case, culture in general, into the American mainstream and have it be heard by a much wider and bigger audience on its own terms. He was also a force for desegregation. He insisted on hiring black musicians in his previously all-white orchestra at a time when it was illegal in most places, not just in the South, for white and black performances to perform together in the same band or in the same group. He said it takes the black keys and the white keys to make good music. It was sort of a throwaway line, but he always had black musicians working with him. And it was, it seems, again, well, good for him kind of thing now, 100 years later, 90 years later. But it was a pioneering thing to do in 1925 or 1930 or 1935. This picture here is from the 30s. There, there's the music I'm not going to play. I kind of want to, but I don't think I will. Anyway, this is a band called the Red Hot Peppers. The leader is a New Orleans piano man by the name of Jelly Roll Morton. And one of his songs was called the King Porter Stomp. And it was something he wrote in the early 1900s, played it. Benny Goodman heard it in Harlem and debuted with it in 1935, and it became a #1 hit around the country. So that kind of process opened up the eyes and ears of many Americans about what black culture was really all about. But there was another aspect to it. This is not just music and people playing horns and pianos and things. At the time, Harlem was part of something bigger known as the New Negro movement. It was a time of African Americans, again, being in a relatively, I'm using air quotes again, safe spot in Harlem, and there was no segregation police out there. It was a black neighborhood with black councilmen and people who could stand up and talk and be heard and not be afraid of being heard. And people took kind of charge of their own life. This sign, it's very blurry, sorry, but what it says as they're driving through Harlem, it says the new Negro has no fear. Pretty profound statement. Has no fear. We don't have to have fear. We can say what we think. We can stand up and be who we are, and it's kind of a liberating thing. And so there was political activism that went with this. A political activist we've heard about, we've talked about before, W.E.B. Du Bois, also very forward-looking, said it right in 1919, the very early stages. as he's in his office, which is in New York, and there's a black regiment marching down the street. They've just come back from the Great War. And he writes this in his newspaper at the time: "We return from fighting, we return fighting. We make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and we're going to save it in the United States, or we'll know the reason why." We talked in class at a little bit later date of early World War II, in which African Americans had a double V campaign. We're going to defeat Nazism, and we're going to defeat tyranny, and we're going to save liberty and freedom, and we're going to do it at home for ourselves. It's the same idea 25 years earlier. Again, not only in Harlem, New York City. The New Negro movement is all around the country. This is on the south side of Chicago, another extremely large African American community, in which there becomes a critical mass of African American citizens and therefore African American voters, and lo and behold, they elect an African American member of Congress. In Reconstruction, there were quite a few in the South, in southern states that were run by Reconstruction governments, and African Americans voted. But there were relatively few African Americans in the North, and no office holders. But now with the Great Migration, we have pockets of population. And on the south side of Chicago, Oscar DePriest, there he is, gets elected to the House of Representatives. What does he do there? What does he accomplish? Well, he doesn't accomplish a lot. He tries to accomplish a lot. And I think that's an important distinction, and it's not to make him sound like a failure. He's not a failure. He's a striver. The battle against lynching was something he led. Lynching was something that was obviously not legal, but it was never prosecuted. It was extra legal. It was non-legal, but it was never enforced. It was never illegal in the southern states where it mostly happened. Congress passed, the House of Representatives passed an anti-lynching bill, which was killed in the U.S. Senate at the time. They blocked in Congress the nomination of a judge to the Supreme Court in 1930 with the help of the NAACP. So political activism is a part of this. And maybe the most, militant's not the right word, strident example of this is Marcus Garvey. Booker T. Washington talked about economic improvement. Well, Marcus Garvey approved for that, and he supported a Back to Africa campaign. Interestingly, the colonization movement failed because African Americans in the 1820s and 30s didn't want to go. Now in the 1920s, Marcus Garvey is saying, let's be proud of that and let's go back. And again, as it turned out, not many went or wanted to. As the 20s came to a close, the Harlem Renaissance came to a close as well. It was cut short mainly due to the stock market crash. People in New York City, which is where Harlem is, with their walking around money, didn't have, as we know, as we've talked about the process, didn't have any money. Often people were buying things on credit anyway. They didn't necessarily have a lot of spare cash, and now they have no money. The loans stop coming, many of them lose jobs, and the economy begins its collapse with the failure of the banks. We've been all through that. Well, the ripple effect in Harlem is it shuts down many of these venues because the venues can't stay open because the people with the money to spend in the venues don't have money, don't go to venues. So what? Is this something that, African Americans did something in the 1920s too? No, not really. The impact was kind of incredible, really. It brought notice to America of African American culture on African American terms. This was not minstrel stuff, it was African Americans performing serious music. Here again, Duke Ellington, on their own terms, and then having that same stuff played around the country and being important to people in the way that any kind of popular culture is important to people. What it did is it instilled in African Americans a kind of a social consciousness that was unable to take root in the South. It took root in Harlem, that's Harlem, and in south side of Chicago, and on the east side of Cleveland, and Inkster, in Detroit, and in various places around the country, various cities around the north in the country. And it is what brought African American culture, which we kind of take for granted. It's funny, you sit in a high school locker room. There's maybe two locker rooms, the visitors and the obviously in the home, and play some teams where I'm coaching now from Youngstown and other places, and there tend to be mostly African American players. And the African American kids play rap music, and the rural kids from Northern Ohio play the same rap music in their respective locker rooms. The idea that African American music culture is mainstream is something we just kind of live and breathe and understand, but it was a revolutionary thing and an evolutionary thing, and therefore an important marker of the 1920s. And there it is. Okay. Harlem Renaissance, an important cultural feature of the Roaring '20s. All right. Talk to you next time. Please subscribe so you can get notice of these things. All right. Bye.